Hey, heretics. In case you missed last week, you might want to go back and listen to part 1 of my interview with Jared Yates Sexton, where we talked about theocracy in America, starting with the theocratic Confederate States of America and how that poison continues to infect us. You might want to listen to that before this, which is part 2 of that interview, where we get caught up into the modern age with theocracy in America. So enjoy. I think what is baffling to people who did not come from religious backgrounds like we do, Jared, is they can't understand the Christian right in America and this looming theocracy because it seems so fucking incoherent.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That how could these very pious religious people who will scream outside of women's health clinics then turn around and support a person who is the 7 deadly sins made flesh for president, right?
Right. And what you end up finding out is that it's all malleable ideology, right?
Right.
It's their ability to weaponize what they say they believe against other people. It's the exact same way that the Trump administration uses the law, right? The law doesn't apply to them. It applies to other people. All of a sudden, the law is there to rein in other people and control other people. It's here for me as a tool to use. And I didn't understand the full scope of it because I knew there was something about the hypocrisy of the church that led to it supporting Donald Trump. And for a while, I just thought it was a Jimmy Swaggart type thing, right? Like, you know, the big hair, the suits, the boisterousness, the open sins. Because Trump, when you really look at him, is a televangelist. That's who he is.
Yeah, he's a tacky fucking carnival barker.
He's a disgusting, just greasy person who bilks everybody out of their money for power. So then I started going back for this book, and I didn't expect it to go down this route. Again, I started at the very beginning of American history, and I just kept finding these bizarre things that really shocked me, right?
Yeah.
That made American history a lot more obvious. And that history, the one that I found for the book, American Rule, I actually found that this history is the accurate history as opposed to American history, which is a propaganda tool. It's a weapon.
Sure.
And so when I got...
That must always preserve American and white innocence.
Right, because it's a cult belief, right?
Yes.
And you go back to what you were saying about the incoherence about the cult belief. The moment that it starts unraveling, it's gone. But you have to continually retroact everything and retro-engineer everything to make it try to become coherent, even though it never even approaches coherency. And I didn't expect to find the cult of the Shining City. But when I did, I have to tell you, man, it messed with my day. Because it was like, I did not expect to go into my beliefs or my upbringing and understand them more through this book. I kind of thought that I came from like a weird group of people that...
The research took you to a much more personal place than you were expecting.
It was shocking, man. It really, really was. And the thing is, I had this moment. So I have this really, really wonderful editor named Maria. And, Maria is straight-laced and no nonsense. And I wanted this book to be as accurate and good as it could possibly do, because I kind of felt like this was like one of my life's works. And so I called up Maria and I was just like, I have to tell you what I found. And I need somebody outside of this to listen to it. And I was just like, I have to find out, like, does this check out? And then all of a sudden, I started talking about it in public. And the thread that you talked about is like one of the places where I've started to try and give this information out before the book comes out, because September's a long way away.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, I started telling people about this. And people started writing back and they're like, this checks out and checks so many boxes that I didn't even know were boxes. And I started to unravel it, and it was just, it's a bizarre thing, but it's absolutely true.
You know what it feels like? And I'm a bit older than you, and I've been paying attention. I read Howard Zinn's People's History quite a while ago. And it's starting to feel like I've got a contrarian view of American history.
Sure.
But what you're describing is, it's the frog in the water that's heating up.
Right.
But then someone shows the frog, a calendar of all the times the temperature's been raised.
And explains water to the frog.
Right. And for the first time ever, the frog is like, oh, holy fuck, this whole thing is a contrivance. Right?
Exactly. And that's the thing that I didn't understand about American history, is because for the longest time, and again, because we grew up in the evangelical church, we are implanted with a paranoia, like a constant fear that there are people plotting against us. Right. And that's at the basis of evangelicalism, is the idea that you are, even though if you control culture, you are constantly in danger of culture consuming you and destroying you.
Yeah.
And
having been raised Mormon, the story of Utah was that they came here to flee the United States and to live in this mountain fortress, and it is born out of this siege mentality. So it's exactly, and
the Christian mentality is all based upon martyrdom, right? And the destruction based under like Roman policy, and it all makes sense when you take that. But then all of a sudden, when you start combining it with white supremacy, which has its own paranoia. Right. And one of the things that I have found in all of this is all of the conspiracy theories that we've ever come across, right? The main ones. And these are the ones that, unfortunately, the evangelical church has come to embrace, including, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, New World Order, Deep State, QAnon, all that shit. If you look at it, the conspirators, the ones who are always working with Satan and for the forces of evil, they're always women, people of color, and LGBTQ Americans, and poor people, right?
And Jews.
And
don't
Jews.
Forget the Jews.
Don't forget the Jews either. And
the Jews are the puppet masters behind the whole thing.
Exactly. And by the way, it turns out that they're always accusing Jews of controlling society the way that they control society, which is another thing. I didn't know that about Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But the protocols were actually a plagiarization of a play that was a critique of white supremacist manipulation. They just changed the names. And so what you find in all of these conspiracy theories, those 5 groups that I just mentioned, remember, it's women, people of color, LGBTQ, poor people, and the Jewish people. Those 5 people are that's everybody but white Americans.
Yeah.
Right? It's everybody who would trouble white supremacy. So these conspiracy theories are ways to manipulate people to believe that they are under attack by these other groups. And I didn't understand how we got there. But when I started piecing it together, again, it blew my mind, because what ends up happening, and I had no idea about this, because we're told that the evangelical right, and now I'm talking about the evangelical right as like the political group. Right?
Yeah.
The group of people who basically took over the culture and fought the culture wars starting in the 1980s.
Yeah.
I'm told, or I was taught, that they started gaining power and purchase based on the abortion debate. Right? Mm-hmm. That's how it's always told, that they that was a step too far, and that was going to be it. That's not true at all. It was actually desegregation in the 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah, their reaction to the civil rights movement.
It was completely their reaction to the civil rights movement. And so the main figure in all this is Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell Sr., by the way, who was a neo-Confederate preacher.
A fucking scumbag. I love what Christopher Hitchens said about him. If you gave him an enema, you could bury him in a shoebox.
I miss Christopher Hitchens.
Don't we miss Hitch?
I'll tell you what, I was just having this conversation with a buddy of mine the other day. What I wouldn't give for Christopher Hitchens and George Carlin to be alive during the Trump presidency. I would, unbelievable.
No doubt.
So, or Hunter Thompson, I'm sure he would have a thing to say about it.
Yeah.
But so you have Jerry Falwell, and he actually was versed in the Confederate preaching that I was just talking about. It didn't go away. Right? He's still preaching that God has drawn, in his own words, that God had drawn a line of distinction between whites and blacks, and that line should never be troubled. And if that line was ever troubled, it was actually troubling the word and belief of a racist God. Right? So all of a sudden, and part of the reason this happens is because Martin Luther King Jr. starts using the social justice gospel of Christ to compel people for the civil rights movement. And it starts actually finding purchase with a large group of Americans, right? Mm-hmm. And because it's compelling, everybody knows that regardless of how you feel about this, the gospel of social justice rings true, right? And all of a sudden, you start
it is one of the redeemable things about the Bible.
Exactly.
I'll try to think of another one, but you keep talking.
Right. No, that's exactly right. I mean, we could be here all day. But, whether you want to get into, whether or not somebody is like a son of God or whether or not a gospel is true, the actual belief behind it, I mean, should short circuit every belief in white supremacy and segregation. Right. And economic manipulation and political domination. So Martin Luther King starts using this, and immediately Falwell and other neo-Confederate preachers, first of all, start calling him a communist, which is what you do. And there's a long history in America where if somebody troubles anything, you call him a communist. The other thing he does is he starts moving towards this white identity, white supremacist, neo-Confederate identity belief that the way that you like, it's actually, again, going back to what we were talking about, it's Old Testament, it's rage and war and smiting
and retribution. Yeah, exactly.
And retribution and
slavery,
right?
Yeah.
And everything that happens in America that is negative. And by the way, people who have heard Pat Robertson, this doesn't sound surprising, right?
Yeah.
Every time there's a hurricane, it's the gays. Right.
Yeah.
Every time that there's an earthquake, it's because, abortion is legal. Yeah. So this God is a different God than the one that somebody like a Martin Luther King is talking about. This God is the God of the Confederacy. And this God is a white supremacist God. And so what ends up happening is you start having things like the prosperity gospel. They start talking about that you can tell God's will. And by the way, if you go back and read Adam Smith, and I feel sorry for you if you haven't already and you have to do this, Yeah. Adam Smith says
it's a chore.
Oh, it's rough. And on top of that, you know what? I'm feeling loose. It's a Friday afternoon. Fuck Adam Smith. So, Adam Smith gets out there in 1776 with The Wealth of Nations and is like, this is how capitalism should work. And we should have an entire society based on self-interest. And he starts talking about the invisible hand in the market. Right? There will be an invisible hand that makes things happen. Well, Falwell and the others say, oh, that's God. And if you make a ton of money and you are wealthy and you are powerful, then God is showing that his favor, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, what are the systems of capitalism and law and politics based on? White supremacy, right? So all of a sudden you have, again, a rinsing or a hiding of white supremacy behind the idea of God's favor. And he finds a willing partner in Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so let's talk about good old Ronnie.
Let's talk about Ronnie. That red baiting, horrid, stupid piece of shit.
Just terrible.
I wonder if you can agree with me, Jared, that I think the myth of Reagan.
Yep.
Because I'm a person who was old enough to witness it as it was going on. And I was like, what the fuck is going on with this guy? The myth of Reagan is one of the most pernicious myths in modern society. And it's so invasive that even people on the left have been completely drawn into him as this kind of symbol of what Americanness means.
John Kerry yesterday, who is the former standard bearer of the Democratic Party, came out and said, Donald Trump, you need to be more like Kennedy and Reagan. Right? Yeah. You hear Barack Obama praising him. You hear, and by the way, this is another thing I learned in the book. We don't need to get off on a tangent, but the Democratic Party basically after Reagan was like, we will never defeat the myth of Reagan. We have to incorporate it into our party. This thing is such an incredibly toxic myth. I mean,
it's so poisonous.
Oh, it's awful. I wrote a thread about it today that one of the reasons why people continue to say, why doesn't Donald Trump become more presidential, is because it created in the presidency the symbol of American exceptionalism. And that's just bullshit. It's an executive position. You either lead or you don't, right?
You're a manager.
You're a manager. So here's the thing about Ronald Reagan. And this was another one of those days. And these were on different days. I didn't even know how they connected. I just thought that Reagan was like a really religious dude that they got in touch with and they decided to work with him. But that's not true. And all of a sudden I had to start looking into somebody like Jimmy Carter that I didn't know enough about, right? And most of the people listening who don't know a lot about history, they're like, oh, Jimmy Carter is a nice ex-president, but he was probably a bad president and blah, 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 blah. Jimmy Carter was kind of an incredible leader who treated the American people like they were adults. And he told them what was going on, and he talked about coming together. He basically gave them secular sermons because he was an incredibly religious guy.
He was a truly deeply pious Christian.
Absolutely.
He still teaches Sunday school when he's not kicking cancer's ass.
Right. I live in Georgia, and all anyone down here will talk about is A, meeting Jimmy Carter at some random function and him being the nicest human being imaginable, and B, Jimmy Carter teaching Sunday school like days after he's been hospitalized, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, just so because we're touching all the bases, let's go ahead and say this. If this country wasn't insane, and if the church wasn't insane, the kind of evangelical that you would deal with in America and in American society and politics would be Jimmy Carter, right? It would be somebody that you could have a conversation with and disagree with. It wouldn't be abusive and toxic and corrosive, right?
Well, yeah, but his particular form of Christianity was not weaponized.
Exactly.
And so the Christian right threw out an actual pious evangelical Christian for an empty-headed, vapid occultist.
And listen, this is the thing that I didn't know, and it blew my fucking mind. There's no other way to put it. It blew my fucking mind, because what I found while I was doing research, because, we've all heard those stories about Nancy Reagan talked to an astrologist and blah, 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 blah. But it turns out Ronald Reagan wasn't actually religious. He was spiritual, and he was heavy, heavy, heavy into the occult. In fact, as president, his chief of staff, I want to say his name was Don Reagan, which is really weird that he had a chief of staff.
I think it was
Don
Reagan. I think it was Don Reagan.
I'm from Greene County, Indiana. I'm lucky I can tie my shoes. I'll mess around with pronunciations another day. But
I'll spit on you from my glass tower in Salt Lake City.
So beautiful place. So
it is.
Don Reagan writes this book, and he basically sounds the alarm. It's like the modern, tell all about Trump, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, listen, Ronald Reagan doesn't know what he's doing. He's completely incompetent. And by the way, everyone should know that he's telling state secrets to an astrologer. And like he's telling this astrologer everything about where he's going. He's making meetings based on this stuff.
Reykjavik, Iceland was picked as the place for the summit with Gorbachev because of the stars.
And he's telling them about negotiations with Russia. So it's like one of these things where, and if you go back, and I found this YouTube video of it there, because there's not much of this that exists in the public record anymore. But like, there's all this stuff where it's like, man, we really should talk about the fact that like he's probably, breaking a lot of laws by doing this stuff. So, so again, the myth of Reagan's not real, right? And Reagan actually, as an actor, in between informing for the FBI and turning in his fellow actors and getting them blacklisted for nothing. And by the way, those were usually either women or LGBTQ Americans or actors of color. Isn't that weird how that turns out? Isn't that odd? It's almost like he had a racial.
So many coincidences in this story.
It's very weird. So in between all that, Reagan gets really, really deep in the New Age scene in Hollywood. And he starts talking to like mystics. And one of the people who is foremost at the head of this is a guy named Manley P Hall. And everyone should look this guy up, because this guy is fascinating.
Yeah, I was not aware of him until I read it in your thread. And I was just like, how do I not know about this character?
Oh, spend the weekend with Manley P Hall. There's YouTube videos of him. There's all kinds of stuff on him. I think I told you earlier, I was like, I kind of want to do a real deep dive on this guy. So Manley P Hall runs across Reagan, and Manley P Hall is this mystic who talks about symbols and occultish meaning and lost meanings and lost symbols. And and by the way, it's like he's selling out auditoriums. He has bestsellers. He is a celebrity mystic, right? And so his entire idea and his big opus is called The Secret History of America. And The Secret History of America says that, and by the way, it involves Atlantis, right? I know that's bizarre that like a lot of people here who are listening are evangelicals who are like, how did Atlantis end up in all this stuff? And why did we always talk about things like Atlantis? It's Manley P Hall. So he's talking about Atlantis. He's talking about the Illuminati, all these secret societies that years and centuries ago, what am I talking about, got together. And they decided to carry out God's will. And they were going to create a great society, right? And it was going to be a new society for a new age. And it was going to be like God's chosen country to carry out justice and the philosophy of humankind. And that's what the United States was. This is one of the reasons why Ronald Reagan believes in American exceptionalism the way he does. And then on top of it, Manley P Hall sells Reagan on this idea that America was inspired and saved by an angel appearing at the Declaration of Independence. That and there's this incredible myth, and I'm sorry to ramble on about this, but it's so batshit insane. There's this myth that Manley P Hall pushes on Reagan that this angel is at the Declaration of Independence, and all of the founders are really terrified to sign the Declaration, and they're not going to, right? Because it could mean death. But this angel shows up and gives this impassioned speech, and then they all sign the Declaration of Independence, and they look, and he's gone.
Dun, dun, dun.
He's just disappeared. Was he ever there? Was that an angel? I think that was an angel. So there's this idea, and Reagan, being an idiot, believes that this is true. And he starts dotting all of his speeches with this idea, right? And
you told me that when Reagan spoke at CPAC, that he name checked this guy.
He does. So at the very first CPAC, and for those listening who aren't aware, CPAC is like this major conservative conference where they test out their ideas and then they find their new leaders, all this stuff. It's
the Legion of Doom. Every
Legion
bad thing
of Doom. So
every bad policy that hurts poor people and queer people, etc., that comes out of that room.
It comes out of CPAC. So at the first CPAC, 1974, Ronald Reagan gives an address to CPAC. And by the way, see if this hits anybody. The Shining City on the Hill. Right? Which is the main operating metaphor for the Republican Party and the United States of America since 1980. Right? This is the leading idea that every president has to mention, every politician has to mention, all of it. He mentions it in this speech where he brings up Manley Hall and he brings up this idea that an angel at the Declaration of Independence inspires all of it. Oh, by the way, that whole thing was completely made up, and it's part of a volume of popular fictions written by Edgar Allan Poe's best friend. So there's that. Jeez. And so Reagan gives this speech that defines the next 40 years based on the idea that America is God's chosen country in spiritual warfare with everybody else, right? So in the 1980s, and I know we can't do this for 3 hours, so we can't talk about all of it. In the 1980s, under Reagan, what happens is there becomes this weird marriage between the evangelical right and their neo-Confederate hyper-capitalistic ideals with Reagan's hyper-capitalism and his occultism. And suddenly
what's crazy is this confluence, and I just am putting this together, this confluence of the neo-Confederate, the white American innocence and power,
right,
and a confluence of this crazy occultist spiritualist Ronald Reagan version of American exceptionalism and power. They combine in the 1980 election,
like a Voltron, exactly, like a Voltron of white supremacy and hypercapitalism.
A non-Christian occultist was the very symbol of America as the anti-occultist Satanic Panic raged under his watch.
Exactly. So what ends up happening, right, exactly. And so through a confluence of things, and I don't know if you've talked about this on the podcast before, but a couple of people to look into for further stuff here, Francis Schaeffer, who creates a thing called How Then Should We Live, which basically says that liberalism is destroying society. And then you have Hal Lindsey with The Late Great Planet Earth, who writes this book that basically takes this new Christian secularism, conservative political movement, and combines it with the Cold War plus New World Order ideology, and basically says we are living in the end times and that America is God's chosen champion. And of course, Ronald Reagan with it. By the way, Ronald Reagan, as an idiot, believes this, brings it up in multiple meetings with people who are just like, what in the hell are we talking about right now? And, so we end up in this weird place in the 1980s, and anyone who lived through it remembers this satanic panic bullshit where, Satan is trying to get to us constantly through, reverse songs, movies. There are satanic sacrifices in every woods in every town. Children
tore through my community.
It
tore through it.
It was a nightmare. And for people who either didn't grow up in the 80s or didn't grow up in these communities, you have no idea how real this was. It was, it was every movie, television show that you watched. My grandmother that I was speaking about, I can't tell you how many books about all this bullshit were in the house and floating around. Sermons about spiritual warfare and how we were in the end times.
Yeah, every misfortune that befell my community was somehow tied to it.
Exactly.
My scoutmaster died in a very unfortunate drowning accident, and it was decided that the Satanists took him out because he was onto them.
I mean, it makes total sense, right? When you really, put it together, that's so tragic and awful. It's awful. And when you really look at it, it is a mass hysteria. And, you can look at everything. And when you start looking at it through this lens and you start understanding it's about the marriage of political power and profit, you start realizing certain things, right? Like, for those who aren't familiar, there was like this, there's a mass hysteria based around preschools, where there was this idea that like every preschool was run by pedophiles who, were abusing children, Satanist pedophiles. Well, the reason why is because preschools blew up because women started going to work and earning money for themselves. Well, you can't have that in a white patriarchal Christian theocracy. Right. Because your child is going to get abused or killed.
A woman's place is in the home.
Exactly. And so all of a sudden you start looking at that. And then all of a sudden, going back to what I said, it's like, well, you can't listen to rock and roll because Satan is on there, right? It'll get you. And all of these things are about that paranoia that we've been talking about, that fragility of white supremacy and white control and evangelical control, and the paranoia of the religion paired with this, again, bizarre, occultish, Reaganish belief. And then on top of it, we come to this point, and everyone who hears this, I'm sure, will feel it. There is the idea within conservative America that if you are poor and if you are suffering, you've done something wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
You deserve it because you have apparently not worked hard enough or been a good enough person. And suddenly our capitalistic society becomes an arbiter of God's will. And
exactly.
And that's where we are now.
People are taught to ignore it. It is a systemic problem. It is a system that creates immense poverty and immense wealth inequality. But no, it's because you failed.
Exactly. Right? And when you look at it through that lens, all of a sudden, white identity evangelical support of Donald Trump makes complete sense, right? Because he is a white nationalist. He embodies this idea that only the wealthy are chosen by God. In fact, he went to these churches. He was married by Norman Vincent Peale, the founder of the Power of Positive Thinking prosperity gospel. On top of that, he is their quote unquote warrior against these outside attacks. And, his wealth is proof that God is for him. And he is the hypocrite that they all are. So all of a sudden, Trump isn't that far from them. He's actually one of them. And when you actually compare him to Reagan, and people don't know this, Reagan wasn't up to date on stuff. He didn't like briefings. He wanted his briefings as cartoons. He didn't work that much. He watched too much TV. He lied so much, it became one of the defining personality characteristics by which everybody knew him. And all of a sudden you look at Trump and you're like, oh my God, it's this thing just playing itself out, and it makes all the sense in the world. It's not inexplicable anymore.
So to sum up, I think what you're saying is that although the Confederate theocratic states of America lost on the battlefield, they ultimately won the political fight after they were washed in the blood of a dim-witted but opportunistic occultist president named Ronald Reagan and the supply-side corporatist prosperity gospel nightmare of a total federal dysfunction and willful inaction in the face of crisis is the desired result of that nearly 150-year-long game.
Well, I mean, if you want to put it that way, sure. I mean, so I just saw this the other day. My friend and historian Heather Cox Richardson has a new book out called How the South Won the Civil War. And I was just like, yeah, I need to read that. I'm really excited about reading that. But I also think that if you really want a full understanding of this, like, you also have to take a look at like Reconstruction and how actually, all these other American lies have added up to this. Because what you're saying is exactly right. The South lost the war, but it won its fight for the identity of America, because after the Civil War, there becomes this new mutant hybrid America that still has the white supremacy, but it can't be completely out in the open, right? It has to be hidden behind the veneer of an America washed clean. And in that way, it is so much like what a church is. It has its aspirational ideals and its actual ideals. It's two sets, or, as some people would call it, an open and a closed system. The open system says, oh, yes, this is the land of opportunity and freedom and liberty. And the closed system says, hey, hold on a second, it's ours. And that is how this is operated and how the church has operated for God knows how long.
Well,
yeah, that was tiring.
We could do this. I could talk to you all day, but we better stop there. Fascinating conversation. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And I'm sure our listeners will too. And if they want to find more from you and about you, where can they do that, Jared?
Sure. I blog over at themuckrake.com. I co-host the Muckrake podcast with my good friend, Nick Hauselman. On Twitter, I'm at JY Sexton. And my books are out there in the world.
Yeah, please follow him and pay attention, because, theocracy is kind of what's for dinner these days. So, all right. Well, thanks. Take care, and hope to talk to you again soon, Jared.
Thanks, man.